I've been looking forward to talking to this man for a long time. Really one of the great memory experts of all time. I remember buying his book when I was a kid, and well, I'll tell him about when we get on. Let's introduce the great Harry Lorayne, memory expert, now to the show. And Harry, how are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good, even with the subway strike here.
I know. How's it going up there? I just watching the news. I'm from up there originally, Long Island. It looks like it's a mess every day getting to work.
Oh, God, it is such a mess. I have a little laryngitis. You'll have to excuse me yelling for taxi cabs. It's terrible, but they're telling me now they may be settling.
Is that right? Okay, I know they're being fined something like $1 million a day, right? The union is up there?
Yeah, I don't know if they'll ever really do it, but that's what they're saying.
Yeah, I know. I mean, first of all, the people in New York don't have any patience when it comes to, the commute to work, and when they have to walk or roller skate or whatever they have to do, take cabs. It's got to be brutal, especially with the cold weather, too, right?
Well, they've been taking it. New Yorkers are funny. For the first 2 days, people are doing it, and laughing. I think if it goes to the fourth or fifth day, we may have violence.
Yeah, right.
I don't think they'll be that thrilled after the third day.
It's not fun, but hopefully they'll get it fixed up, and look for the fare increase to come soon afterward, Harry.
Oh, that's for sure. In any case, let's talk about memory.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I just was telling the audience, and when I was 10 or 12 years old, back in the mid-'70s there, I was in the airport. We're going on a trip somewhere, and I saw your book in the airport shop, and I got it. It was the great memory book you did with Jerry Lucas, and one of my favorite books of all time.
Thank you very much, but it's interesting. That was that came out 1973, 74. But my first book, How to Develop a Superpower Memory, Doug, I think came out long before you were born. That's 1956.
Is that right? Okay, I didn't realize that.
Yeah, that sold 8 million copies. I'm knocking wood as I talk to you.
That's great. Yeah, I know the one that you did then was with. I was a big Knick fan back then, and Jerry Lucas, of course, a big star with the Knicks, and you kind of teamed up together on that one. We did so many TV appearances as well.
We did, but I have to disappoint you a little bit. Lucas had as much to do with writing the book, Doug, as you did.
Right, I understand.
But he did help me promote it, which is why I put his name on
it. Oh, sure. Well, more from a Knick perspective that I like Jerry Lucas.
Oh, yeah, he was a big... But you know what's interesting, talking about that? He's kind of been forgotten because, I get this to this day. When I meet people, they say, oh, you wrote the book with Dave DeBusschere, or you wrote the book with Walt Frazier. They forgot Lucas.
That's right. Yeah, he has kind of disappeared. I know he became a preacher, didn't he? Later?
He got into religion, but that's a long story. He did it because he didn't want to pay taxes. It's a long story.
Well, enough about Jerry. Let's talk about you, Harry. I remember seeing you a lot on the Mike Douglas show when I was a kid,
gosh,
and of course Johnny Carson, working with him. How was that? He passed away about a year ago now. How was it working with Johnny Carson?
Well, he was a dear friend, Johnny. He was a fan of mine, which was kind of difficult to handle because he used to act shy in front of me, Johnny started as a magician, as a ventriloquist and a magician, and one of my avocations, Doug, is card magic. I've written 25 books on the subject, so the assumption is I know what I'm talking about, and I published a magazine a monthly magazine for magicians for 20 years. It's kind of a hobby of mine, and the reason I mention it is Johnny subscribed to the magazine, and he always bought my magic books, and he put me on 23 times. I was on the show with him.
Yeah, I know it was quite a few times. I know you do the performance where you would memorize everybody in the audience and then give out their names while they're on the air. That's a great. I think you did that on the Mike Douglas show too, if I remember correctly.
I did. Yeah, I did. Oh gosh, I must have done the Mike Douglas show 40 times, Doug. That's those days are gone. With there was Mike Douglas and Merv Griffin at shows that we did. But it's okay. I've done the Regis Philbin show, for example, 5 or 6 times.
Oh sure, yeah. That's I kind of miss that too. Just those kind of talk shows. We kind of try and do that here on the radio to kind of bring that back a little bit, just having people like yourself on and conversation shows. You don't see that much on TV anymore.
No, you don't, and I think that's very good because people learn from that, I believe.
Yeah, I really.
If you get interesting guests.
Well, you're interesting. We wanted to have you on for a long time, Harry.
Well, look, I'm here for you.
Talk a little bit about you have some a new product out you want to talk about? New book out?
Well, not really. You know what happened with, I'm kind of semi-retired, Doug, and most of my work is with corporate people. I'm talking about the 400 largest corporations in the world probably use my systems as part of their regular training programs. They finally realized, it's been for a long time now, they've been doing it. it's got to be 25 years, that they realize that memory is very important. I mean, if you're selling insurance, and if I called you Sam instead of Doug, you're not going to be too anxious to buy my insurance policy, you know? And they also found out that when you as a potential client ask a question of the insurance salesman, like what is the premium for such and such an insurance policy, if they have to take out that big book of premiums and look it up, you've lost a little bit of confidence. And if you can answer immediately, you've gained some confidence. So corporations have started to learn that people should know their style numbers and prices and names of potential clients or current clients is very important. So anyway, the reason I mentioned that, what has happened, I do seminars and motivational speaking, demonstrating the memory work for corporations. And what happened is, I couldn't do it all. I could only be at one place at a time. So what I did is I put together what I call the Memory Power course, which is a bunch of videos and a bunch of CDs of me personally doing the teaching. In other words, it was the closest I can get to personal instruction from me, because, as I say, I couldn't be at more than one place at a time. So that's my main product now. It's 1,000,000 times better than a book, because sounds egotistical, but I don't care. Modesty is becoming a drag. It's me doing the teaching, Doug, and that's the Memory Power course, and people can learn about it if they go to HarryLorayne.com. Yeah, that's a problem, because people are not sure how to spell my name. So if you go to FantasticMemory.com, see, my feeling is this: if you can't spell fantastic, I'm not going to be able to help
that's
you.
Right.
So if you go to FantasticMemory.com, you come to the same website, and you'll see Dick Cavett and Mel Brooks and people like that talking about the Memory Power course. I think you'll find it interesting.
It really is. They're fun websites you have, Harry, and I enjoy looking at different kind of websites. And yeah, I think you make a good point there, particularly us down here in the radio business. You have the sales staff. Remember people's names and faces. Obviously, if you can do that without having to look at a card or something like that, it gets that one-on-one going right away, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. You know what it reminds me of, and I've written about this in a book, and so I'll kind of paraphrase myself. As I say, basically I started as a performer, and I would be at these big conventions that corporations have, and I'd be sitting on the dais. I hesitated because I don't know if it's dais or dais. I think if the dinner is over $50, it's a dais.
Right.
Otherwise it's a dais. In any case, I'd be sitting there, and I have to be there early because I'm going to meet all the people as they come in, to remember the names, which is part of my thing. And I heard basically all the people saying, "Oh, how lovely to see you. How's the missus? What have you been doing with you?" All these nice remarks. But nobody was making eye-to-eye contact. And I finally realized why. They were all looking at each other's left chest area. You know why? Those name cards.
The name tags.
Because they didn't know who the heck they were talking to. So, but it's so obvious when you're saying to somebody, "Oh, how lovely it is to see you," and you're not making eye contact.
Oh, yeah, I know. We're talking.
So, I would notice these things, and Doug, it's the universal memory complaint. The universal memory complaint is, I'm introduced to somebody, and a minute later I forget his or her name.
That's right, yeah.
And I've said for years, that's a lie. That's not true. You don't forget his or her name. What you've done is you haven't remembered it in the first place. Usually the way you're introduced is, "Mr. Miles, say hello to Mr. Film. You hear a mumble.
Yeah.
There's no way to remember. And incidentally, the reason you're hearing a mumble is because the introducer don't remember the introducee's name. So hearing a mumble doesn't do it. And it's such a simple thing. It's such a simple, basic idea. Make sure you hear the name in the first place. That's the first step.
I know, remember from reading your book, you would say try and find maybe an outstanding feature on the person's face or the hair color and associate that with the name. Maybe make the name, if it sounds like moose or something, associate it with a moose, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Wait,
yeah.
You know what it is? Yeah, I have a cliche, Doug. It's a contradictory statement. The statement is this: even if my systems don't work, they must work. Now, of course, that's a contradictory statement, but I know exactly what I'm talking about because just trying to apply my systems, even if they didn't work, which of course they do beautifully, but even if they didn't work, has to better your memory. I'm going to tell you why, if you've got a minute.
Sure, go ahead.
Okay. What you just said is there are 3 steps to remembering names and faces. The first step is to make the name meaningful, as you just said. For example, let me use an example. How about just some years ago, I met a gentleman by the name of Mr. Puck Shiver. Now, that's a difficult-sounding name. It's a Polish name. It's got a lot of C's, Z's, and Y's in the spelling, but it's pronounced Puck Shiver. Puckzzyva, something like that. Now, how in the world are you going to remember that? You see, most names are conglomerations of sounds. They have no meaning. Your name happens to have meaning, but most names don't. Okay, the first thing you have to do is to make that name meaningful. Now, how would I make a name like Puck Shiver meaningful? Very simple. I thought of a hockey puck on ice. What do you do when you're on ice? You shiver. Puck Shiver. Now, all of a sudden, don't you see what has happened here? Suddenly, I can visualize that name. The reason most people don't remember names and numbers is because they're abstracts. They have no meaning. Puck Shiver is a conglomeration of sound, unless maybe it means something in Polish, but I don't know that. So to me, it's a conglomeration of sound. What does a number mean? What does 5 mean to you, except that it's one lower than 6 and it's one higher than 4? It's a concept. It's abstract. You can't visualize it. What I do is I teach people how to make things abstract. How do you like that? I just made up a word.
Yeah, I like that.
It's not a bad word. You make things meaningful. That's the point. You see, the concept is anything that you can see in your mind's eye, anything visual is easy or easier to remember. It's that simple. Anyway, getting back to Puck Shiver, here's the point. When I said even if the systems don't work, they must work. In order to do the little thing I just told you, in other words, to take the name Puck Shiver and make it meaningful by thinking a hockey puck shivering on ice, you had to do something that 99.9% of the people in the world don't do, and that is listen. How in the world could I come up with a puck shivering on ice if I didn't hear the name in the first place? That's what I mean when I say even if my systems don't work, if you try to apply them, you have just paid attention to that name. Now, the next step is what you said. Look at the person's face. You see, all my systems are based on the reminder principle, Doug. One thing reminds you of the other, and that's a natural phenomenon. We all do this. We go through life looking at something, hearing something, thinking something, and saying either aloud or mentally, oops, that reminds me. In other words, if you looked at a book and it reminds you to buy a carton of cigarettes, I'm just making up these silly examples, somewhere subconsciously you had made a connection, an association between book and cigarettes. You had to.
Right.
That's why book reminded you of cigarette. The problem with that is that it's a subconscious calisthenic. You do it without realizing it. So if you made a strong association, it reminded you. If you didn't, well, you forgot it, in quotes. That's the problem. You have no control over it. I teach people how to do it knowingly, how to make that association in your mind knowingly. Once you do that, one thing reminds you of the other. A face reminds you of a name. A telephone number reminds you of the person you're calling. The English word reminds you of the foreign language equivalent. All things break down to units of 2. One thing reminds you of the other. So now you look at the person's face and you pick an outstanding feature. Now, that could be anything. In my classes, I have people look at my face and shout out, what do you think is the outstanding feature? I'll get 10 different things, which is fine. In other words, what you see as the individual or important feature, that's what you use. Now, again, look what I forced you to do. In order to select an outstanding feature, again, you do what most people in the world do not do. You have looked at the face. In this era of television, I guess it is, people look at my left ear when I'm introduced to them, and I have to keep leaning to the left and say, look, I live here in my eyes, not in my ear. People are not making eye contact.
No.
But if you look at a person and try to pick an outstanding feature like his high forehead or his big nose, whatever, you have been forced to look, and that's half the battle. I've made you listen, and I've made you look.
We're talking with Harry Lorayne, and we were in the middle of talking about how you remember faces and names. And Harry, I think the third step we're up to, right?
Yeah, the third step is we get back to what I call the reminder principle. You've got the 2 important things. You've made the name Puck Shiver visual in your mind. It's a hockey puck shivering on the ice, perhaps. And you've picked an outstanding feature, let's say, a high forehead on the person's face, Mr. Puck Shiver's face. Now you got to connect the 2 so that one reminds you of the other. And you got to make it silly. There is another principle of mine. I call it the slap in the face principle. I'll tell you why. I'll drop a name. Aristotle, 3,000 years ago, was a teacher. He was a philosopher and a teacher. When he made what he thought was an important point to his student, he'd slap the student in the face very hard. The concept being the student would never forget that moment. But that hurts, and I'm too small to do that, so we do it mentally. And so make it silly. That's the slap in the face. Because we tend to forget, and I always put the word forget in quotes, we tend to forget mundane, everyday things. But the unusual, the impossible, the violent, the terrible, those things we remember easily. So make it silly, make it impossible. I would see 1 million hockey pucks, 1 million, I exaggerate, hockey pucks coming out of that gentleman's forehead, and they're all shivering. That's it. I have now locked it into my mind. And that's all I do. That's what my students all over the world do, who remember names at their meetings. You know, I remember 400, 500 people at a time. But I do that only to show people that it's easy to swing one bat when you practice swinging three. You don't have to do that. Most people don't have to remember 400 names like I do. You want to remember 12 at a meeting or your customers every day.
What was the most
that's all you have to do.
What was the most names you ever did in one particular performance?
You know, when I first started, Doug, that's an interesting question. I was on an ego trip. I would remember everybody in my audience, up to 1,000 people, till I started to realize that by the time I got to the 300th name, I could read everybody's mind. They were saying, "Great, what else do you do?"
Yeah.
You know? So, in other words, I'm also, as I said, I'm a ham. I'm an entertainer also, and you have to draw a line. You know, you remember 300 names, people think it's terrific. By the 920th name, they're falling asleep.
Yeah, right.
You know, so even though I do it with humor and laughs and etc., but to answer your question, regular audiences, 200, 300 people, I remember everybody in the room. For another reason, if I left out one table, let's say, they would be insulted. You know, so I have to be careful.
Yeah,
I have to draw kind of silly lines.
Now, at one time you were memorizing, was it the New York City phone book? Was that the one you were doing?
Well, no, I used to do that as a gag, but basically what I do at every lecture is I memorize a current issue of a current magazine, a weekly magazine.
Right, I remember that,
yeah, like Time Magazine.
And
that's what I do. And
they
you
call
would
out
see
the
that
page, and you would know what the ad on the right corner or the story on the left corner. Yeah,
exactly, and you would see that on my website, because when they put the website together, they took a piece of that from an appearance of mine and stuck that in where I do the what I call the magazine memory feed.
Yeah, that's a great performance
that's done,
when you do that.
Incidentally, again, you know, I do these things. Why in the world would you, Doug, or any of your listeners, why would you want to remember what's on every page in Time Magazine? You wouldn't. But in certain businesses, like I mentioned the insurance business at the top of the show, you want to remember your premiums. You want to remember what you read if you're going to school. For students, it is the greatest help in the world.
Harry, we just got about a minute left. Why don't you give out your website again?
Well, like I say, it's Harry Lorayne, which is spelled Lorayne. So it's harrylorayne.com, or easier to remember, fantasticmemory.com.
That's great. Harry, we got to have you on again. If you're available after the new year, we'd love to have you back. There's so much I'd like to ask you, and we're just out of time today, but appreciate you coming on today. I've been a big fan of your work for a long time, and let's do it again maybe in January, February.
Be my pleasure, sir, because I just got started. You know, I'll be on for a couple hours.
You're like Milton Berle. He said he would bow for 40 minutes, right?
Exactly. Good to talk to you.
Thanks, Harry.